Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming out. I'm glad that we can close out the year with Dante. I know you weren't trying to imply that this has been an inferno of a year, but it does seem appropriate. But it actually leads to the question which I'd like to open by asking both of you, and maybe Michael, you could answer first, and then Joseph. So we in 2021, I believe, was the 700th anniversary of Dante's death, and if you go into any bookstore, you'll find several translations of Dante. You probably won't find more than one translation of Boccaccio, and you probably won't find any translations of Petrarch or Guido Cavalcanti or any other Italian writer of that period. In fact, you could probably say that Dante is the best known writer before Shakespeare even in the English-speaking world. So I wanted to just to start with, why is that? Why is Dante such a big deal after 700 years? Why is he so enduring and popular?
Is this on? Well, to begin with, of course, because he's a great poet, one of the greatest who ever lived. He is telling in the Divine Comedy a story that is fascinating in and of itself. He presents a gallery of sharply drawn, psychologically credible, unforgettable characters. And more than anything else, of course, is the amazing unity that he creates with so many disparate elements of the poem. Not only the things that I've mentioned already, but obviously a great deal of religious discussion, a great deal of mythological reference, biblical reference, of course, and the political, social, ecclesiastical history and battles of his own time and place, and somehow not only unifies all of this, but makes it universally significant.
There's a little bit of everything. Everything is contained in him. Joseph?
I think Michael's answer is great. My advisor in graduate school, Giuseppe Mazzotta, used to say that Dante was an encyclopedic poet. That, you have history in the Divine Comedy, you have politics, you have literature, of course you have religion, and that's absolutely true. I also think there's a more personal reason why after 700 years we're still reading Dante. If you think about the opening of the poem, those famous lines, nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura. In the middle of our life's journey, I found myself in a dark wood. That space of crisis that everyone ends up in at one point or another in their lives. Dante, of course, was a Christian. It's an intensely Christian poem, but it appeals to so many different readers, I think, because of that universality of the human experience that he signals right in the beginning of his poem. So I think that as much as the kind of intellectual, cultural forces that are at work in the poem, it's his ability to draw the reader in and bring their own experience to the work that has kind of guaranteed this extraordinary run of 7 centuries and counting.
That leads me to the next question I want to ask, which is about your own personal encounters with Dante. Michael, your new translation of the entire Divine Comedy, all 3 books, continues the translation that you began 20 years ago of the Inferno, the first part of the poem. What first drew you to Dante as a reader? When did you first discover him?
I originally read Dante in college in translation. I can't recall the translation now that was used in the class, but it made no effort to reproduce the poetic effect, and therefore made much less of an impact on me than it might otherwise have. I read Ciardi's translation not long after that. But what led me to Dante as a translator, as opposed to merely a reader, came about through outside circumstances. I was not impelled. I mean, like everyone else, of course, I thought there are already more Dante translations available than anyone can use. And of course, that's become infinitely more true in the intervening 30 years or so. But it was the annual Dante reading at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine that inspired me to tackle the translation. it began in 1994, and like everyone else that first year, I just grabbed a text off the shelf and read. But I thought, if they do this again next year and they ask me again, I think I'll try translating my own canto. And the following year, I did the same thing, and I decided I'm not going to spend 34 years on this. So I decided to just tackle the whole thing and go straight through with the Inferno.
And those readings are on Easter weekend, the weekend?
Yeah, they were originally
Saturday?
held, and for many years held on Holy Thursday or Maundy Thursday, as it's known in the Episcopal tradition. Although since the pandemic, things have been opened up a bit. They're just held sometime in April, as close to Easter as possible, and also to commemorate Poetry Month.
I remember year after year not being able to go because of Passover, so I knew that it was around the time of Easter. Joseph, how about you? What brought you to Dante and specifically to La Vita Nuova, which is a sort of whole different version of Dante than you get in the Divine Comedy?
Yeah, I mean, really, till now we've been talking about Michael translated the kind of the monumental Dante, the Divine Comedy. That's his most famous work, this 14,000-line poem on the state of the soul after death. And I translated a youthful work by Dante, his first poems and his autobiography of how he fell in love with Beatrice, his muse, and became a poet. I would say, Dante first came alive to me when I went to Italy for the first time. And it didn't happen until I was an undergraduate. I went on my junior abroad. And it was kind of strange that it took that long because my parents were actually born in Italy and immigrated to the United States, as did my 4 older siblings. But it was a working class family. My dad was a factory worker. Travel to Italy was really out of the question growing up. So when I went back as a student, I remember when I went back to my parents' birthplace, Calabria, which is a region in the south, and I met my uncle Giorgio, who had never been in school, who was, really sort of completely removed from the intellectual, literary, cultural world. But when I told him I was studying Dante, he said, Dante, la bocca sollevò dal fiero pasto. He started quoting the Inferno, like verbatim and perfectly. He lifted up his mouth from the savage meal. That's the Ugolino episode in Inferno 33, where it's one of the most gruesome episodes in Dante. And I thought, how in the world did my uncle, how has he memorized Dante? And it just spoke to me about how pervasive Dante was as this kind of cultural force. And I think that was a signal that I took back with me, and eventually I would specialize in Dante in graduate school, and I teach Dante now every year at college. I've written about him. And the Vita Nuova was the work that I just felt had been missing in English. There was something about it with my students. It's a youthful work. Dante started writing his poems when he was 18, and he anthologized them till he was 30. And I just felt the translations that were available weren't capturing that youthful energy, that kind of risk-taking, that sense of falling in love with poetry and falling in love with his muse. It wasn't a kind of romantic love with Beatrice, but it was a kind of worship of her as a muse figure that I just felt my students weren't getting it, and that I had to somehow throw my hat in the ring. And so that's the sort of the journey to the translation. But I think that the original impulse to, in a sense, devote my life to studying Dante happened with that homecoming in Italy and that moment when I realized that this was part of my family's lifeblood in a way.
And I'm right to think that you've also written a book about the Divine Comedy that's published recently.
Yeah, I wrote a book about In a Dark Wood, what Dante taught me about grief, healing, and the mysteries of love, which is a very personal book about the death of my late wife, Catherine, right before she gave birth to our child, and how Dante helped me really survive the aftermath of grief and then mourning, and how I lived with the Divine Comedy in a very personal way for the most difficult years of my life. And, you know, I had been trained as a scholar. I was a teacher of Dante, but this book took on a life that I had, of course, never imagined, because I didn't imagine something like that ever would happen. It was sort of, I felt like I heard his voice for the first time, really heard his voice, and tried to do justice in it in this book. And translation is trying to do justice to a different kind of voice, where you're literally trying to capture the original language, whereas In a Dark Wood was the spirit of Dante that I was trying to capture.
Well, that's a perfect introduction to ask both of you if we could hear a little bit of your versions of Dante. Maybe Michael, would you like to read a passage and introduce it and tell us about it?
All right, but before doing so, I just wanted to make the point that I was very struck by something Joseph just said about his approach to the Vita Nuova. And it sounded as if what he was suggesting is that most of the other translations were done by people with an awareness of what Dante would subsequently become and what he would subsequently achieve. And that what you wanted to do was to cleanse your mind of Dante's future and just try to inhabit the spirit of the young man who wrote that work.
That's beautifully put. Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And also, since you mentioned Ugolino a moment ago, that I'll choose a passage then from near the end of the Inferno, in which the character of Count Ugolino has been imprisoned with his 4 sons. Now, the number of, not the number of people, but their relations to him is slightly variant in Dante's version from the reality. But Ugolino has been betrayed by his former co-conspirator, and he and his 4 young sons have been imprisoned in a tower, and the tower door has been nailed shut, and he realizes that he and his sons are going to be slowly starved to death. So picking up then in the 33rd canto of the Inferno, when Ugolino has just awakened from a dream that symbolically seems to suggest their fate. Day had not dawned, but I no longer slept. My sons were there with me. Though still asleep, they called to me to give them bread, and wept. You are cruel indeed, if you can know the deep dread that I felt and not yet shed a tear. If not this, what could ever make you weep? The time of our morning meal was drawing near. My children were awake. Their dreams had stirred in each of them uneasiness and fear. From the horrible tower's base, I heard the door being nailed shut, and I looked into the faces of my sons without a word. I did not weep. I was turned to stone all through. They wept. And Anselmuccio spoke up when he saw my face. Father, what's troubling you? I shed no tears and gave no answer then. And all that day and night I sat like stone until the sun lit up the world again. As soon as a small ray of sunlight shone in the miserable cell, and I could see 4 faces show the aspect of my own, I bit my hands in grief and agony. And they, assuming that I acted thus for hunger, quickly rose and said to me, "Eat of us, Father, it'll hurt us less. From you we have this wretched flesh we wear, now it is yours to take away from us." I calmed myself to keep them from despair. Alas, hard earth, you should have opened wide. 2 more days passed while we sat silent there. And when it was the 4th day, Gatto cried, "Father, why don't you help me?" I watched him fall outstretched before my feet, and there he died. Just as you see me now, I saw them all between the 5th and 6th days, one by one, drop down and die. Now blindness cast its pall. For 2 more days I crawled from sun to sun, calling to them who were already dead. Then fasting did what misery had not done.
It's one of the most famous passages, and it's terrible. And you mentioned not quite in line with reality. So this is a real thing that took place with Ugolino. Could you tell us about the sort of basis?
Ugolino had been accused of having betrayed castles necessary for the defense of Pisa, I believe it was. And he had conspired with the Archbishop Ruggieri. And then, as I said, the Archbishop had sold him out subsequently. The variance from the historical reality was that Ugolino was imprisoned with 2 sons and 2 grandsons, not 4 very young sons, as Dante presents it. Obviously, Dante is less concerned with historical accuracy than he is with getting the greatest dramatic impact of the situation. Oh, I'm sorry.
Which sort of raises an interesting question about the Divine Comedy, which is that for its first readers, these would have been current events or recent history, right? That we think of these as ancient events because it's 700 years ago, but it would be as if you were writing a poem about what was happening in your own city, in your own country, in your own time.
Yes, and just as a number of people have done, actually, reworking the Inferno and putting our contemporaries, whether famous or, again, as in Dante's case, personal enemies into hell.
Joseph, the Vita Nuova is a much more, we've got a musical accompaniment. There's no one gets eaten in the Vita Nuova. It's a much different kind of poem.
Something gets eaten, though. That's a good segue, actually.
Yeah, that's right. I inadvertently gave
yes.
a segue.
It's so interesting because, as I heard, that's one of the most dramatic scenes in all of Dante and all of literature, really. But there's kind of a comparable scene in the Vita Nuova, which I think makes for a nice segue. And it's interesting because it's also a turning point for me in translating this book, because I had wanted to do it for a long while, but something held me back in that I'm not a poet, and I felt I had to translate these poems as poems into verse. And I didn't want to do prose translations. That would just not feel right because they're so self-consciously highly wrought poetic objects. So I spent a couple years studying verse, meter, reading a ton of different poetic forms. I got to the point where it's like, okay, maybe I can do this. If I'm not a poet, at least I can do good prose verse translations. And a turning point was this particular poem that I'll read. It's the first poem that Dante ever wrote. And he wrote it when he was about 18 years old. And it's an amazing poem because, the first lines he ever wrote were, "To every captive soul and gentle heart." And the last lines he wrote in the Divine Comedy were, "The love that moves the sun and all the other stars." So there's the kind of beginning and end point of his career. And this poem is an amazingly dramatic moment because he sees Beatrice every 9 years. That's how the muse works. She shows up like clockwork every 9 years. He sees her when she's 18, and it's his first adult sighting of Beatrice. And he goes back to his room after he sees her, and he has this remarkable dream where Beatrice appears naked in his dream, covered only by a crimson slip, and being carried in the arms of love, the god of love. And she's eating Dante's burning heart. Talk about an erotic dream, okay? So I sat down to translate that, and it was the moment when I felt, and I shared it with some trusted readers, it was the moment when I felt, I can do this. This seems to work. It has some momentum. I'm going to, that the book sort of took off from there. So it's Dante's first poem, and for me, it was what I felt like was my first poetic translation. So I'll read to you. To every captive soul and gentle heart, I now address these words of mine to you, in hope you will return with a reply. As I salute our Lord, the God of love, a third of night already had eclipsed the shining of the brightest stars on high, when suddenly love came before my eyes. The thought of him still haunts my troubled mind. He held my heart in hand and seemed all joy, my sleeping lady wrapped inside his arms. Then he awakened her, and she, in fright, began to humbly eat my burning heart. And then I saw him disappear in tears. So that's the end of the poem, and then I'll just read a little prose, because the Vita Nuova is part poetry, part prose. I'll just tell you what Dante does. This sonnet is divided into two parts. The first offers greetings and asks for a reply. The second describes what the reply should be about and begins, a third of night already had eclipsed. Many responded to this sonnet with different opinions, which is true, by the way. He had a doctor friend who was a poet who basically told Dante in very much more graphic, explicit terms than I'll use, that he was overheated and needed to take a cold bath. You can read the notes for what he literally said. And he said, among those who answered was the one I call my best friend. Now, this is a remarkable poet, Guido Cavalcanti, who was Dante's mentor and the person he dedicated this book to. And he composed a sonnet that begins, I think all virtue came before your eyes. Our friendship started when he learned that I was the one who had sent out that sonnet. The true meaning of my vision was not grasped by anyone at the time, but now it is clear to even the most simple-minded. And I love this scene because it captures that Vita Nuova quality of this young poet emerging as a cultural figure in his hometown, sharing his poetry with his cohort and asking them for meaning. And essentially, it announces his arrival as a poet, as a late adolescent. I always tell my students to think of it a little bit. You remember that film, The Dead Poets Society, where these poets would get together and read poems and celebrate life? That was a little bit Dante and his circle. And they were incredible poets. Guido Cavalcanti, Dante. It's really the invention of Italian literature as we know it, because it's the literature in Tuscan, in the vernacular, not in Latin, not in a learned language, which, of course, Dante would write the Divine Comedy in Tuscan and not Latin, not because he thought he would reach more readers that way, because he would actually have reached more readers with Latin, which every educated person in Europe could speak, but because he wanted to create a living, organic, cultural form in the Tuscan language. So
we heard about the structure of that book. Michael, tell us a little bit about the structure of the Divine Comedy, what Dante's Italian is like, and what kind of challenges it presents for translating into English, because Italian, of course, has a lot more rhymes than English does.
It's customary for most translators in their prefaces to say that because Italian is so rich in rhymes and English much less so, that they have not tried to keep the rhyming pattern of the original. And I just have to say as an aside that there's something in that point of view that has always suggested to me the assumption that what the poem says is more important than its form, its structure, how it's composed. I've always tried to approach it rather as a balance, as an interplay of form and structure, and to try to reproduce the rhyme and the meter. Obviously, with a poet as rich as Dante, as we've already discussed, there are many dimensions to the Divine Comedy and many potential audiences for it who would approach it for different reasons. And different translations are tailored to different sensibilities, different audiences. And no one translation, I dare say, could be considered definitive. and no one could say this is the way it has to be done and no other. But terza rima is a structure that Dante originated for the Divine Comedy. Terza as in 3-line units. And the rhyme pattern is at the first and third line of each of the 3-line units or tercets, rhyme with one another. And the ending sound of the middle line then becomes the basis for the rhymes of the next tercet, and so on, so that you have a situation in which the units of the poem are simultaneously independent and interconnected. So there is a continuing with the rhyme as well as with the narrative, a great propulsive element in the Divine Comedy. Another thing that distinguishes it from many works of the time, which now seem to us rather static and remote and difficult to read. So in translating terza rima and attempting to keep the rhyme pattern, you can never just take a tercet in isolation. You always have to be thinking about what the rhymes are going to be in the next tercet and making sure that the second line ends with the right sound.
And it's part of the sort of strangeness of Dante, or one of the disciplines that maybe modern readers have to learn in order to read Dante, is that in addition to being this poetic technique, there's also a sort of theological implication behind it, right? Because there are lots of threes in the Divine Comedy. There's 3 parts. Each part has 33 cantos, and the lines are in 3 sections. And so what is the sort of religious background to this?
Well, the Trinity is the most obvious element. And yes, you're right that Dante had a fascination with numbers that would delight many contemporary believers in astrology, though Dante himself is rather scornful of astrology. That his concern is always with the religious symbolism of as Joseph has pointed out, but the number 9 as well, which is obviously the square of the Trinity.
And Joseph, one of the interesting things about the Vita Nuova is that it seems in some ways so pagan, or compared to the sort of detailed Christian dogmatics and theory of the Divine Comedy, you have this sort of almost a cult of Beatrice. It's a love cult. There's a lot of sort of sublimated sexuality involved. How do those 2 parts of Dante sort of fit together?
You know, it's interesting because the numerology is in the Vita Nuova as well. He meets her like clockwork every 9 years. There's the whole sort of symbolism of that, the Trinity, in the number 3 is the root of 9. But what's so interesting about the Vita Nuova, and there's many scholars, of course, who do read it in an intensely religious, allegorical sense, that somehow Beatrice is a reflection of the divine. There's a Christological element to Beatrice. One of the things about my translation that became really important to me was, in addition to the poems, you know, I teach Dante every year, and I write about Dante. There's an essay that's the introduction where I feel I put my reading of the Vita Nuova on the table. And the way I see the text and the numerology and the religious element, I think what happens is that something really unusual happens in the Vita Nuova. Beatrice dies. A muse wasn't supposed to do that, not at the age of 24. So halfway through the book, Beatrice dies, and Dante is without his muse. Now, there was no romantic love that we know of between them, but I think what happens, if you read Dante's response to Beatrice's death, he goes into this numerological disquisition that she died on such and such a day, which in this calendar means this and that one means that, and it's completely unconvincing. You want to shake him and say, Dante, someone's just died. Basta with the numerology. Because I think what's happened, and this is my interpretation, the Vita Nuova becomes an essay in the middle. There's a kind of narrative black hole created by the death of Beatrice, in which Dante doesn't know exactly how to write about her. So he falls back on numerology. He does the traditional things. He almost meets a new muse, the donna gentile. But the meandering of the text in the middle, there's this moment where 1 year anniversary after Beatrice's death, Dante is in the center of Florence, kind of absent-mindedly drawing an angel. And to me, that's an image of grief and mourning, where he hasn't come to terms fully with her death. My interpretation is that it's his first encounter with death in a cataclysmic sense. She's someone he loved. She's someone who was from his social world, someone he was very close with, if not romantically involved. And unlike all the other poets who had interchangeable muses, including his mentor Cavalcante especially, Dante realizes that Beatrice is not fungible, not changeable, that she is the muse. And so he ends the Vita Nuova by saying, I will say no more about her until I can write about her in a more suitable way, basically, which, of course, is the Divine Comedy 2 decades later. So I think that the whole apparatus of numerology and, I don't think Dante's a mature religious thinker at this age. He is when he writes that, but that's a very different book than this. This, to me, is sort of like in the tradition of James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. It's a manifesto of a young creator sort of staking out his principles. And so to me, that takes precedence over any potential allegorization of Beatrice or sublimation of her as this sort of religious figure. I really honestly think that it was the encounter with her death that changed him as a person and changed him as a writer, and that essayistic sort of meandering at the center of the Vita Nuova reflects, the word essay means an attempt in French, to find something. He's trying to find the right genre to account for this intensely consequential personal loss.
And then, of course, Beatrice comes back in a sort of more directly allegorical guise in the Paradiso. How does she enter into the Divine Comedy?
Pardon me. She makes her official entrance rather near the end of the Purgatorio, just a handful of cantos before the end, in what used to be the Garden of Eden, and at the top of Mount Purgatory, to which Dante has ascended. And at this point, Virgil, who has been his guide now from the very beginning, through the intercession of Beatrice, for what amounts, therefore, to 64 cantos and 64% of the entire poem, Virgil silently and without any notice whatsoever disappears from Dante's side, which of course signifies that human reason can guide one only so far, and that the faith must guide you the rest of the way. And the change of guide from the human to the heavenly, you might say, signifies this process. And Dante frequently, at the end of the Purgatorio and the Paradiso, talks about how he is overwhelmed by the beatific vision of Beatrice. And she even says at several points that if she really turned up the wattage of her smile, of her appearance to full blast, that Dante would be blinded, if not dissolved. So,
do you want to read from that end of the Purgatorio? Give us a little flavor of the entrance of Beatrice.
Her entrance, by the way, at her entrance, she severely rebukes Dante for his infidelity in having pursued other gods and other goals after her death. including, she suggests, chasing after young women. To what degree and for what purpose is not really made clear. And following up on Joseph's point about how that the Vita Nuova does not describe a romantic relationship, despite the erotically charged dream that Dante describes. It's interesting to note that even in the Divine Comedy, Dante makes some rather free scatological references here and there. So he's quite open in talking about the body's functions and especially its waste products. But one dimension of the body's functions he is not so explicit about. And any kind of reference to matters sexual in the Divine Comedy seems to run the whole gamut from prudery to euphemism. And so, as I say, at her first appearance, Beatrice is very angry seeming toward Dante because of his failures. So you can pick up.
Of course, is it just a coincidence that he found a real woman whose name means blessed, right? Whose name's that, so she was as though predestined to be an allegory, right? She was perfectly suited.
Indeed. I mean, that was, of course, her name. Whether that factored into his decision to make her his muse, you might be better positioned to address.
I don't think the world will ever know the answer to that one.
Do you want to read us a sort of early Beatrice poem, and then we can contrast it with the Beatrice of the Divine Comedy?
So I'll read to you what Dante says. There's a moment in the Vita Nuova that's a real turning point for Dante, where he's been writing for this sort of, I use that metaphor, the Dead Poets Society, or, tortured poets department, people would say nowadays. And it's a very restricted world. It's just a few other elite poets. So that's who the only people who read his work. But there's right at the end of the poem, there's a religious procession going through Florence, and it's pilgrims on their way to a holy site in Spain. And he has this moment where he says, if I could write about Beatrice and communicate what she really is, these people would weep as I weep. And it's the first time he's opened up his idea of what his audience should be, rather than these restricted group of poets, but it should be an anonymous public, these pilgrims going by. And very soon after that, the poem ends, and I'll read to you the very ending where he says basically that he's going to say no more about Beatrice. After this sonnet, there appeared to me a miraculous vision in which I saw things that made me resolve to say no more about this blessed one until I am capable of describing her more worthily. To get to this point, I am studying as much as I can, as my lady truly knows. And it's interesting because the text switches to the present tense kind of for the first time. It's like the past recollection is over, now we're in the present. I am studying, my lady knows. Should it please him in which all things live, and if my life were to last long enough, I hope to be able to say things about her that were never said of any other woman. May it please him who is the Lord of all goodness that my soul one day rises to see the glory of his lady, that blessed Beatrice who gloriously gazes into the face of the one who is blessed for all eternity. And the text ends right there. The romantic in us wants to believe that Dante was thinking about the Divine Comedy at that point. But it's not the case at all, because he finishes this in 1295, and he's about 30 years old, and something happens that Dante could have never foreseen that leads directly to the Divine Comedy. He's exiled from Florence in 1302, 7 years later. So it's the exile, the trauma of exile, the separation from Florence, and the knowledge that he'll never return, that a few years into the exile, he starts to write the Divine Comedy and spends the last 14 years of his life on it. So it's not that this last chapter predicts the Divine Comedy, but it's an interesting affirmation of silence until the next occasion to write about her in a more suitable way comes.
As I said, when Beatrice and Dante are finally united in her afterlife, near the end of the Purgatorio, she upbraids him rather vigorously in her first extended speech to him, which begins, "You keep your vigil in the eternal day." So neither she's speaking to the angels who are her handmaidens at first. You keep your vigil in the eternal day, so neither sleep nor night makes you miss one step of the world as it goes on its way. I am more concerned that he who weeps upon the other shore may understand and know grief equal to the guilt of what he's done. Not only by the spheres above, which show each seed to its appointed end and place, according to the ruling stars that go with it, but by the bounty of God's grace, which reigns from vapors so high over us, they lie beyond where human sight can trace. In his new life, this man's potential was so great that with each proper disposition, the outcome should have proved quite marvelous. The land most capable of strong fruition when ill sown, tended with indifference, falls into the most rank and wild condition. Still I sustained him with my countenance for a time, and with my youthful eyes I led and drew him toward his proper goal. But once at the threshold of my second age, I had changed lives. He then turned from me to begin following after others in my stead. When I rose from flesh to spirit, growing in beauty and virtue, in his eyes I grew less pleasing and less dear than I had been. His steps pursued a way that wasn't true, chasing false images of good that lead with promises but never follow through. Each inspiration that I could succeed in winning, whether dreams or otherwise, to warn him with fell short. He paid no heed. He fell so low that every enterprise to save him failed, except to make him see the lost souls down in hell with his own eyes. I went to the gateway of the dead when he who brought him to be here among us stayed. He heard the prayers I offered tearfully. God's high degree would be breached if he made Lethe's crossing and could come to know its water's savor without having paid the scot of penitence that makes tears flow.
So it's kind of amazing to think that Beatrice herself never knew that Dante was writing about her, never knew that he had built all of these ideas about her. All of this would happen after her death because she died at a young age, and she's become one of the most famous people who ever lived as a result of.
And to add, to the layers of irony, Dante had a wife, the long-suffering Gemma Donati. Beatrice, the Divine Comedies, I think, 14,000 plus lines. Gemma Donati got 0 lines. So the iniquity of literary history.
Go marry a poet. That's what you get. You probably didn't think we were going to get Taylor Swift in this discussion tonight, but we did. So I think we have about time to have some questions from the audience, if there are any. If anyone wants to ask any questions, yes.
Yes.
So one of my reactions to Dante is just the incredible accomplishment of his work. I mean,
Yes.
It's not only incredible work of imagination where he's able to envision these worlds in his own mind. And at one point he discusses flying on basically a dragon for someone who's never even been up in an airplane.
Yeah.
But it's also, I think you mentioned it's encyclopedic, at least I'm right here now towards the Divine Comedy, where he covers mythology,
There's that line in To the Lighthouse where Mr. Ramsey is like meditating on his greatness as a philosopher, and he's like, my mind could go from like A to Q. That's not bad, but Shakespeare got to Z. There's only once in a millennium someone gets to Z, and I guess Dante is one of those minds that gets to Z. Look, I teach Dante for a living. It's a mystery to me. It really is how it's the most erudite work of literature I've ever read, the Divine Comedy. The references to, as I said, all the musics, literature, science, religion. And this was not someone who had a cushy academic position. He was on the run, basically, for 20 years in exile, moving from one city to the next, always precariously, always hounded by poverty. And he somehow managed to synthesize all this knowledge and information. I don't have an answer as to how, there's erudite poets, Goethe, Milton, but then the conditions under which Dante processed all that knowledge. And this is the 1300s, it's not like books were everywhere. It does really boggle the mind. I think that's actually more of a challenge for Michael, because when I translate the Vita Nuova is a youthful work, and it's not elusive to the way the Divine Comedy is. It doesn't make as many. It makes references to the Bible and to cultural history, but it's not as layered with allusions to cultural history and the world of knowledge the way that the Divine Comedy is. So, yeah.
And just to follow up quickly on two of the points that Joseph just made, that indeed it is the most erudite work of literature, but what keeps it from being just a dry document of the learning of the past is that it's also, and again, as I said earlier, all this is amazingly seamlessly integrated. It's also the most human, the most dramatic work of literature that one could imagine. And that's what, of course, keeps it perpetually alive. And the other point is that, as you began by saying, we customarily mention Shakespeare, Leonardo, Mozart as examples of people whose genius was so great, so astounding, that they seem to transcend the limits of humanity. Sometimes Goethe is mentioned in that context as well. But I would agree, as you suggest, that Dante should be on that short list too.
One more question? Yeah.
First of all, congratulations on your achievements. And I have a specific question about your methodology, how you translate, like when, for how long, where.
Give us a glimpse inside the translator's study.
Well, obviously a great deal of my time and energy went into trying to find the rhymes that I needed. And there are any number of times in the daily round when the body is occupied and the mind is free. When, for example, waiting to fall asleep at night. And it's a fascinating process. Often I would fall asleep trying to come up with a rhyme that I needed and failing to do so, and then waking up and suddenly having it, wondering if I was still working even while I was asleep. Or walking the dog, or taking extended drives. And there were any number of times when I had to pull over at rest stops on I-91 in New England, not for the usual reason, but because I wanted to jot down the 12 or 15 lines whose rhymes I had worked out in my head before I forgot them. And so to clear the space to go on to the next batch of rhymes. And it took a while, actually, to get out of the habit of constantly trying to come up with rhymes. And even now, when I'll hear an unusual word, a common English word, but one that you don't hear every day, I'll find that I'm automatically trying to find two rhymes for it.
You can kind of imagine that maybe Dante was doing that too, right? He was whatever he was doing, he was going in his brain, the terza rima. Joseph, what about you?
So, as I think Michael said it earlier, there's no rule for translation. There's no rule that it has to be more or less like the original, more or less contemporary. Every translator makes the decision that works for them. When I teach Dante, even to my students who don't speak Italian in translation, I like to have a dual language edition because I want them to feel the aura of the original language, and for that to kind of keep us honest. So, as with my students, I tell them don't read introductions to books. Read it first. Go through it on your own. Unprotected, unshaped. Then we'll discuss it in class and maybe read the introduction afterwards. Similarly, I do a first pass of a translation just with my naked eye. I don't look things up. I just translate it without paying too much attention to the finished product, but I want to engage that original, and I really want to feel that original, even if I don't fully understand it. So that's what I do first, and then you refine that. I actually wrote like a few words on that, if you don't mind if I just read it from my introduction. Dante will always be one step ahead of all of us who translate him. The best one can hope for is to create pleasing, useful, and accurate approximations of his towering original. Yet how thrilling it is to encounter this magical work in its raw and unmediated form. It is above all that transporting energy, mystery, and strangeness of the original that I try to bring to the reader. Early in the Vita Nuova, Dante describes Beatrice appearing to him naked in a dream, covered only by a veil. That's what translating the Vita Nuova can feel like. The text comes to you in its raw and unadorned Tuscan, covered by a veil of time and linguistic difference that you try to render transparent as you layer it with new words.
That's a perfect place for us to end today, I think. Do we have time for... We do have a time for... Yes. In the back row.
I'm going to ask the same question two different ways.
Sure.
And the first is, I read a translation with Professor Luzzi's guidance, and I found at the end that it was one of the most spectacular things that I had ever done, and the fact that it took me until after I retired to actually do it was something that made me happy about retirement. But on top of that, I couldn't help but feel that my mother, who never had the education I had, but could actually read it in Italian, was somehow able to have an experience with the poem that I'll never be able to have. And since the two of you obviously are fluent in both languages, can you, even like something as crude as percent terms, tell me how much I'm missing by appreciating English, but not being able to read it in Italian? Only I can appreciate the sound in Italian, which of course is a big thing, but I know there has to be stuff in the genius of it that I just will never grasp.
People always say, it's a cliche, that translation is impossible, that you'll never get the original. And there's an element of truth to that. I actually think translation is miraculous, that you can somehow get some sense of the original in another language. Always just floors me. However, comunque, as the Italians would say, there are moments that just the original. Like in Paradiso 25, Dante lets down his guard and says what writing the Divine Comedy has meant to him, how it has made me lean and hungry through these many years. And you can really feel his suffering in exile. And he says that it barred me from the bel ovile ovio dormaniello, from the fair sheepfold where I slept as a lamb. And how can you translate that? Bello ville ovio dormaniello, the soft sounds of that. You just can't do it. It only exists in the miracle of the original. So yes, there are some things that just cannot be translated. individual elements, but I think the whole experience of the poem can come through. Yeah.
Flip side of that is, are you aware of anybody trying to use artificial intelligence to translate Dante? And do you think that someday a machine will be able to take all the things that you know would have to be in a, quote, perfect translation and outdo what humans have done in the multiple translations?
Michael, will you become obsolete at some point? Will you?
No.
Never.
No, artificial intelligence will never be able to perfectly translate because it obviously will not contain and communicate or even understand the human dimension of the work. In response to the question that was asked, let me say first, one of us here is fluent in Italian, and it's not me. I did not learn Italian when I was young enough to really master the language. Italian in the household in which I grew up was the language my parents used when they didn't want us to know what they were talking about. And when I reached the age of around 30 or so in the 1970s, I began to feel somewhat deracinated, wanted to get in touch with my roots and to try to understand the language of my ancestors. And I decided that since I'd been writing poetry almost all of my life, that the best way to do it would be to find some nice, tidy little Italian poet who'd never been translated into English and teach myself as best I could the Italian language. Obviously, I came to it long after my sutures had closed up, and so I will never really be fluent in it, but I do what I can, and that leads me to the other point I wanted to make about how translation is generally considered to be impossible, and all translations are inevitably failures. And yes, that's true. But I made the point once in an essay when John Huston's film of James Joyce's story, The Dead, appeared in 1987. Several reviews made the point that no movie could ever capture the depth and complexity and sheer brilliance of Joyce's story. And of course, that's true, but so what? Wouldn't you rather have Huston's movie than not have it, no matter how far short it may fall of the original? And I think that's true of translations as well.
All right. On that note, I think we need to wrap up. So the authors will be our Virgils. To the guys of Dante, please join me in thanking them for. And they will be outside where you can purchase copies of their book and have them signed, which is almost as good as if Dante signed them himself.
That was great.
Thank you
It was a
very
pleasure.
much.
Thank you.